Okay, so I'm here to change things up a little bit, though there will be some connections to some of the compliance and other issues that have been raised in the preceding presentations. But here I'm going to be talking about this idea of big data, and it's both the opportunities that it affords us in the research enterprise, but also some of the things that we really need to be thinking about when we're either working with big data or when we're thinking about even our small data in the context of a world of big data. So first, as a means of introduction, I want to tell you a little bit about myself to provide some context and understanding of sort of where I come from in this big data scenario. Is I've been here at campus for over 20 years, starting out as a graduate student, working in dissertation research that actually integrated a lot of data, environmental and archaeological data from the Four Corners region in my research. But I really started to get into what might be described as some of the larger data scenarios when I started working at the Earth Data Analysis Center, now almost over 15 years ago, helping to design some of the systems we were using to manage some of the data sets that we were using in that applied research center. And then much more recently, I've started working in the library as the director of our Research Data Services program, again with the primary focus on really facilitating effective research data management across the university, both in terms of training, providing infrastructure, and helping our researchers across the entire institution learn to work more effectively with the research data that we're managing. So as an illustration of sort of some of my interests in big data or data management in general, this is an illustration of 15 years, or almost 15 years at the Earth Data Analysis Center, of the data trends for the data clearinghouse that we managed there. And I actually, even as a graduate student, was developing the platform that we were using to manage these data sets. And that started down here where we had maybe just 2,000 or 3,000 little data sets sitting on the system, measured in gigabytes of data. But we very soon started adding large chunks of data, in tunes of like 8,000 to 9,000 additional data sets at one time, multiple terabytes of new data coming into the system. That just continued to accelerate as new data sets were coming in, and we continued to evolve our capabilities. But then you see this spike here as we started to work on some NSF-funded projects where we were explicitly developing infrastructure to more effectively manage research data. And you can see that we saw, while there was pretty slow growth here, some steady growth here, but then this massive acceleration in both the number of data sets we're managing and the speed with which the collections are growing. This required a set of changes to the infrastructure that we were making. And I only bring this up as an illustration of some of the thinking that you might find yourself going through as you're starting to work with data that may be larger than you have previously worked with. And some of the details here aren't important, but with each one of these steps, we are adding additional technical capacity to more effectively manage and make use of the data that we were making available. So when we start talking about big data, it's often used more as a marketing term than anything else. Not very clearly defined, often referred to in sort of a business context. But when we're talking about research data, we're more frequently talking about some of the classic research big data problems like model or global observation data, or streams of data coming out of instruments, or maybe digitized and scanned data coming out of large paper collections, but also large collections of information about people, whether it's medical information, imagery, or medical records, information about how people interact with each other through social networks. These are all examples of how big data come into the research enterprise. Some common characteristics of definitions of big data, if you start looking around, are what are often called the 3 V's: volume, velocity, and variety. And any particular problem that you're working in that might be characterized as a big data problem may only require one of these to start to push the boundaries of what your current technologies or technical approaches can do, your current workflows or habits. These are all things that can be overwhelmed by any of these attributes of a data problem that you're working with. For me, I actually look at this much more simply. A big data problem is one where the tools that you have do not work effectively for the problem you're trying to solve to effectively and responsibly manage the data that you're using in your research project. While playing at the beach is a lot of fun, trying to shovel several yards of sand with a plastic shovel and a bucket is not a happy day at the beach. And it's the same thing when you're starting to deal with large, complex, high volume, high velocity collections of data as in service of your research problem. So you need to start expanding your thinking to new technical approaches, new models for how you handle these increasingly large and complex data sets. So I'm going to run through 3 quick scenarios of different big data analysis situations, and then at the end of each, highlight some issues that are sort of evident in these particular scenarios as really a thought exercise to start you thinking about what you might need to consider in your next research project when you're starting to encounter some of these challenges related to your data. This first one is around this common situation where you have a massive volume of data, you have a very significant research problem you're trying to address, and you really benefit from being able to have those large volumes of data in close proximity to high performance computing, high capacity computing. This is a paper that was published in Science magazine in late 2013 by a group of researchers at the Global Land Cover Facility, which actually itself has a tremendous collection and capacity for data. But in this case, they partnered with Google in doing essentially a high-resolution reconstruction of forest cover for the early 21st century, trying to analyze what changes had occurred between 2000 and 2012. This was a classic big data problem. As you know, there are some tremendous visualizations of these data, but when you start looking at some of the numbers of basically treating the entire globe as your unit of analysis and including 143 billion individual pixels. You know, this room here is probably about 15 meters square. Imagine a space twice the size of this room and then replicating that over the entire surface of the planet. That's the spatial resolution of the data that they were managing. As a part of this, they talk about processing over 20 terapixels of data. That's the equivalent of about 2 million very high quality images that you would generate from, say, a digital SLR. And 1 million hours of computational time on 10,000 computers. This is where Google and the Google Earth Engine, their platform that actually manages Earth science data and provides computation on top of those data, was key to the success of this research project. They even have an interface where you can actually download the products. So this is a way to fulfill those obligations that we all have to actually effectively share the data underlying the research papers and conclusions that we're reaching. This is all great stuff, but it does raise some potential issues in terms of how we define our partnerships and who we collaborate with. So in this case, there's always that long-term question of how is long-term access to the data going to be facilitated? If Google next week decides that they don't want to be in the business of running Google Earth Engine anymore, where will those data be accessible from? How will you be able to potentially replicate the processing required to generate these products, to reproduce the scientific outcomes from this? This isn't necessarily bad things about this research project, but it is things to be thinking about when you're developing any partnerships that you're really forced to when confronting these issues of having access to computation and the capacity to process and analyze large volumes of data. Our next scenario is potentially a bit more controversial. Last summer, there was quite a bit of press around a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about an experiment that had been done at Facebook. And it was published through a collaboration between researchers at Facebook and at Cornell University. And some of the headlines that this got was tinkers with emotions, manipulating user feeds, and asking about essentially the ethical implications of this particular research project. As you look at sort of the details, you can see where there might have been some opportunities for slipping into at least some gray areas. And that's a lot of what the characterization of some of the response to this research project came into. But here in this study, they randomly selected nearly 700,000 Facebook users. And for those Facebook users, they then characterized essentially the comments and the posts by the friends of those Facebook users, characterizing them as being somewhat negative or positive, and then actually changed the mixture of the elements going into the feeds for the nearly 700,000 users to essentially make them either more negative or more positive. And then characterizing those users' posts as either negative or positive to see if there was a relationship between essentially the tone of their friends' posts and the tone of their posts. This ended up actually yielding what was characterized as a small inverse statistically significant effect where essentially negative tone of the friends tended to produce a slightly positive tone in the users and vice versa. So needless to say, when the story about this got out, you could think of, okay, there's a billion Facebook users out there, and many of us in this room probably are Facebook users, and about 1 in 2,500 Facebook users at that time was a participant in this research project, whether they knew it or not. And so the questions that came up as a result of this, thinking about some of the issues that were raised, particularly about the negative press that came up as an outcome of this, and this is an opinion piece that was published also in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about 3 months later. First was this regulatory angle in terms of what exactly constitutes human subjects research. There were some arguments, and you see arguments on both sides of this, that given the fact that Facebook is continuously tuning and tweaking their algorithms for determining what goes into any user's feed, this was just basically a variation on a constant changing process. And so in that respect, it may not actually rise to the level of being defined as human subjects research by many of the regulatory frameworks that folks are accustomed to working within. Another one is the requirements for and the content of informed consent. Because that is one of the standard requirements for human subjects research, is this idea of informed consent, particularly within our regulatory framework that we operate in. Do the end user agreements that we all click through and most of us don't read for Facebook or other social networks constitute informed consent? Those agreements do typically state that what we're providing, what we're interacting, our interactions with those systems are subject to research. Is that adequate and sufficient? So that's something else to be thinking about. When we're dealing with some of these large global networks, even thinking about what particular regulatory frameworks are in effect. The EU has their concept of the right to be forgotten. They have different privacy regulations. You very well have EU participants in this experiment. They have somewhat different expectations. They operate in a different regulatory framework. When you're talking about global data being collected and being brought into a research project, you have to vastly expand the regulatory network that you're trying to be compliant with. And then finally, there was some finger pointing at PNAS itself in terms of what role they might have had in being more diligent in asking the authors to demonstrate and describe in more detail the work that they had done to comply with whether it's the IRB protocols at Cornell or other protocols to assure essentially the privacy of the participants were being looked for. So some of the issues here are, it's not always clear-cut what exactly constitutes human subjects research. We have to think about that. What does informed consent look like? Is it an end-user agreement, or is it a specific form that is read and filled out and acknowledged related to a specific research project? Figuring out what regulatory requirements are in play in a particular situation, as they may vary from project to project or data collection to data collection. And then this last one in terms of the balance of the roles between a commercial entity that, depending on the regulations, may and doesn't nearly have the same obligations that those of us in an academic environment have, as our universities have signed into the protocols for IRB review and all of that. So what is the balance between collection by commercial entities that have one set of standards to adhere to and our obligations as researchers within universities? These are all things that we need to think about in a scenario like this, where we may be partnering with an organization that is bringing some very attractive and interesting and fascinating data to the table. But how do we handle that? The third one is related to this idea of personally identifiable information and the concept of anonymization or de-identification. Which unfortunately nowadays is a diminishing capability. The previous models that we had developed where we thought we were effectively hiding or preventing the release of personally identifiable information in the world of big data, so you don't even necessarily have to have a large data set yourself, but in the context of the availability of other large data sets that are out there available for everybody to use, your small data set could be fairly easily correlated with other large data sets, effectively eliminating the promise that you have made to your subjects to maintain and protect their identities. So in this case, one of the conclusions of this legal review from 2010 is that basically data can be either useful or perfectly anonymous, but never both. Because by the time you go to the lengths of essentially scouring all the elements from a data set that would prevent de-anonymization of it, you have probably reduced the value of that data set to nearly zero. Graphically, we can see that here, where this is a set of 16 images, random images from my personal photo collection, which doesn't tell you necessarily a lot about me. I'm not actually even in any of these photos. But if we start bringing more and more pieces of this same collection together, we eventually can produce a fairly reasonable facsimile of me. And this is not just a visual metaphor, but it's actually a term that is used, in this case, in a report from the Office of the President in May 2014, highlighting some of the challenges and opportunities that big data provides, and looking at essentially the policy environment around the management of data and how you balance the opportunities afforded by big data with the sort of threats to our understood and valued ideas of privacy and such. Another illustration is an analysis from 2000, where basically 3 separate pieces of information that really hadn't been thought of as being necessarily increasing your vulnerability to having your identity, being able to uniquely identify you. It turns out that the combination of your sex, your birthday, including your year and your zip code, actually can pretty much uniquely identify you. So so you might have this great data set. You take out the social security numbers, you take out the names, you take out the street addresses. You say, we're good to go. I can share this with other people. No such luck. Somebody with these 3 pieces of information may be able to very easily correlate your data with other databases that contain that same information and much more. So this is, again, how we need to think much more carefully about what we're doing when it comes to protecting the identities of the participants in our projects. Again, we don't have to be even doing this on a large scale, but it is something that in the context of other data that are available, we have to think about. So we need to think about what mosaic may be created by the combination of values that are in our data set. But also, how do we maintain and balance between this increasing demand to release the data and information that we're being sponsored to generate with this requirement to provide privacy and assured privacy for our participants? And so this is a balancing act, especially as we're seeing the reduced capability to assure the anonymity of our participants. We have to do some careful thinking about. So this is just a recap of those points that I've made so far. So I won't actually reiterate them here, but these are absolutely some of the issues that you need to be thinking about, whether you're working with what you might describe as big data or not, but certainly in terms of how you can effectively manage and use and assure that the research products that you're generating, the data that you're managing are managed securely, safely, and effectively, both for your research project and to meet obligations to the future researchers who may also make effective use of those data. The good news is you're not alone. There is help available here on campus, and you've heard about some of those resources already. There's our Research Data Services group in the library. You can just email us at rds@unm.edu. We're right now in the process of redoing all of our web assets, so I don't have a good stable web address to provide you, but this is a good place to get in touch with us. We provide services in helping you to plan to manage your data, hooking you up with infrastructure that we help to maintain for collaborative data management and collaborative software development, archiving of your data for long-term preservation, documenting your data, workflows, all of those things. If you have questions about pretty much any aspect of your data management, you can come talk to us and we can help you, and we can also hook you up with the other folks on campus or elsewhere who may also be able to assist you. When it comes to some of these privacy issues and the human subjects research, we have IRB as of course, a key group that you're going to be working with in those areas. But I would also recommend Information Security Services, Security at UNM. They also have a very firm grasp on the breadth of regulatory sort of interactions with all information on campus, including research information, so that's another great resource. And finally, if you are in this situation where you're needing to align computation with data, the Center for Advanced Research Computing is another great resource that all of us as researchers at UNM have access to. And our group at RDS can help you get set up with working with the folks at Carsey, or you can work with them directly. So with that, any questions? Because I guess I'm out of time, but...
Out of time, but it's good for a big question.
What's the moral of, the fact that, gender, your actual birthday, and I'm in charge of one data set, and something that I could do proactively is just get rid of the month and just the day of the day.
Right. Well, yeah, and the bad news is there's not necessarily a single answer. It's really a matter of looking at the nature of your data and thinking about it from the perspective of an evildoer who would actually try to look at your data and make determinations about the participants in your study based on the information that you would provide to them through, say, the public access to some sort of anonymized data set. So, and this is where it really is more of a thought process and thinking about it analytically, because unfortunately there isn't just a recipe. It's more a matter of having it on your radar and working with the various experts on campus to try to figure out what is essentially the due diligence that you need to exercise. That's certainly what the IRB protocols are designed for you to basically, so the institution and you as the researcher can say, we've given this careful consideration, we've worked hard to try to do the right thing, And everything doesn't go perfectly all the time, but we've done our best effort. And that's really what the bottom line here is. Anything else?
In the journal today, they had a big article about the NSA and this and that and all these agencies that are collecting data on all of us. Would you say that that's the least of our worries?
Well, I think it's only one of them. Because, you know, when you think about essentially the business use of personally identifiable information, the databases that exist out there that are being passed around in the commercial sector of, you know, all of our individual financial transactions, our credit records that, you know, when I set up an account on some system, for TIA CREF, and they were asking me questions to verify my identity that, as I looked at them, I recognized that they were probably coming from my credit report. They knew more about me than I could remember. I couldn't actually remember the answers to some of the questions they were asking. And these are all sort of being passed around behind the scenes between these other agencies. So this gets back to essentially those small incremental data sets that we may be putting out there that feed into these systems, because there are aggregators that basically hoover the world for data to figure out how they might be able to generate a commercial or profitable product from it. So to be honest, yeah, the NSA is the least of my concerns. It's more how the aggregate information about me and every one of the rest of us can actually be combined and sold and resold and used.